like it feels like there's something in the middle that's still that people are yearning for that doesn't exist yet.
Like what, Britt?
I don't know, like Path 2.0 or something.
I feel like a lot of this podcast is Brett goading Dave into restarting Path, and I'm here for it. Hi, guys. How's it going?
We're back.
Going.
Week 18.
It's going. I just had the most harrowing experience of my recent, at least of this week, which was driving on New Jersey turnpikes. Which
it's called the Turnpike, not New Jersey Turnpike.
No, but there's so many and they converge. And then Google doesn't tell you if you have to be on the right to be in the local exits. So you go straight to the George Washington Bridge when you're trying to get back from visiting the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island with your boys and to make it in time for this podcast. So thank you guys for the grace period. But honestly, when you see all the local exits on the other side of a divider and just George Washington Bridge signs, you think you're going to Manhattan.
Well, just, Waymo is going to save you from this, right? So
no, Waymo's clearly going to take you to Manhattan. Look, as someone who grew up in New Jersey, this is a classic New Jersey experience.
This also brings back a lot of our dating history where I kept getting lost visiting you in New York City cabs. Do you remember this period?
Well, at least you found him sooner or later.
Jones Road. I actually was having total flashbacks to that.
All right. Should we get into it?
Yes. Well, this is obviously a very important and troubling time in the world. And Sam, you want to kick off with sharing some of our thoughts as a group?
Well, I think we talked a lot about what to talk about this weekend. I think it is impossible to not talk about the Israel-Hamas situation. We're not a political podcast, nor are we political experts. We're tech people. And so, we have plenty of views on this, which you can read elsewhere, and happy to engage on social media with you on that stuff. But this podcast is going to be on the tech side of it and the important tech stories about it. So, that said, it's impossible to not start out by saying that, we're just floored and upset. And the situation with Hamas is completely beyond comprehension. They're a terrorist organization and there's no two ways about it. What they've done, the atrocities are beyond pale. We just wish the Israeli people the best in doing the extremely painful and hard work ahead, which clearly has to be done. So I think with that, we'll talk about tech, but an incredibly sad and upsetting week and situation in the world. On the tech front, because that is what we do, 3 things to talk about. One, I want to talk about funding and LPs, and especially in this era, how as a company or as a fund, how do you think about who's funding you and who you're funding? And kind of in light of some of the geopolitical situations and how global capital is, how you should feel about that and how you should think about that. 2, we got to talk about social networks, and in particular, Section 230 and news on social networks and kind of the cabal of this. This was going to be an issue anyway. I have a great column written, by the way, Jess, for you about this.
I saw 3 in my inbox. I've been a little busy. I had
a little time on my hands with travel, so I've written some columns for you. But on this one, it's, really this was going to happen anyway. We're 14 months out from a U.S. election. AI is now a thing. It's time to talk about it, but it's very relevant with the situation that's unfolding now. And then 3, I want to talk, at least I would suggest we talk about tech leaders and the interesting thing about who can say what on the internet, right? Because normally we talk about how empowered VCs and especially tech leaders are to speak their mind and the truth and how hemmed in politicians are. But in this instance, with this situation, we're seeing the opposite, which is, Biden can say the right thing. The UK Prime Minister can say the right thing and do the right thing. And it is interesting to watch a lot of leaders in tech and certainly academia just be completely hamstrung by this situation.
Let's start here, Sam. And thank you for I think this would be the first 3-point more or less agenda. So we can check that.
Wow. Sam made the agenda. Good job, Sam. You would have been my last pick for the best agenda, but I liked it. I think you did an A+.
I'm either no agenda or tight agenda. Nothing in the middle.
Yeah. Well, I like your agenda, but I'm going to start with the last one because this has really, really been reverberating through my brain through witnessing all the horrors, but then the reaction from business leaders, right? Which tech leaders said something And then to Sam's point, what did they say? And I'll just say, it seems to me like there are a lot of leaders that are not taking the action of really condemning Hamas in this case, but are instead either focusing, like saying we're focused on our employees, we're feeling the pain of watching all of this, all true and empathetic messages. But I'm kind of, if you are a leader who feels compelled to speak out on this, I personally actually believe you have a moral responsibility to kind of say more than, my focus is with our people. Now, if your focus is with your people and you don't want to speak up, fine. But I think it's fair to kind of demand of the leaders who are kind of issuing these statements, which are inherently leadership statements. Why are they saying them? To kind of criticize them for not, I think, condemning the terrorism in stronger terms. But I'm curious what the Morins think.
Well, I'm curious if it's not coming or if it's just not coming yet. I think there's such a fear of cancel culture these days that I can imagine a lot of these leaders really do want to say something, but like have to go clear it with their PR teams and their board and their blah, 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 and like work on this whole strategy of like what their approach is going to be. And like, instead, it feels like we've lost the humanity in these situations where a person can say what they feel because they're going to get attacked no matter what they say. And I can see both sides of that, but it's sort of part of the timeline of where we're at in culture and social media today.
Well, I just think it's interesting, right? Because again, I go back to this whole like the difference between politicians and tech leaders, right? And normally the dynamic is the politicians say incredibly bland nothing burgers because they have to appeal specifically, to constituents, and they're kind of hemmed in by that, or at least except for the extremes on the left or right who just say crazy sauce, right? But like normal politicians. And then you have, the tech leaders who are very empowered to speak on all sorts of issues that they have no bearing on, right? In very extreme terms. I mean, Elon probably being the most extreme version of a guy who just says stuff, right? But when it gets to this stuff, I think global companies, I think this is the real problem with super globalized companies, right? This is, as hot as it gets in terms of culture issues, right? I've personally been shocked, by some of the responses of some people I've seen online and really been like, that person's not who I thought they were, right? In ways that I'm not used to. And so I think that it really is an interesting problem if you're leading a super global organization with footprints everywhere and employees everywhere you're trying to protect and whatever, to think about what you can say. I think the answer is, very fairly, very little, unfortunately. So it's funny. I don't condemn or I'm not upset that some tech leaders aren't saying more, but it is an interesting wake-up call about who can say what in very public forums, right?
Well, what they're saying, I don't, I may have followed this a little too closely, but like, the statements like, what's happening is shocking. That's a very typical, like, that's what you would see, from people like Andy Jassy or Mark Zuckerberg or Adam Mosseri or any of these people who have spoken out. And yeah, it is shocking, but it also, people are unwilling to go a step further and sort of condemn these terrorist attacks. And if you look at like, I think this is a very interesting question, sort of where this war falls on the spectrum. But if you think of 9/11 in the US, for example, you would have seen very different language.
That I agree with.
And
that is upsetting.
And Barack Obama, President Biden, global leaders around the world are willing to say that, to your point, Sam. And, the business community is not willing to kind of draw those comparisons or use their leadership position to sort of support that that's what's there. And you say, you mentioned Harvard University. This week you've been very active online, along with a number of other important people, like our good friend Larry Summers, who have really been calling Harvard's statements, wholly unacceptable. And those two, and there's been a series of them, but after an initial silence, they
unfortunately, Yale's was quite good.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I think this is the way I see it. Is it seems like there's a spectrum of, where we are, where I actually think the universities, the elite universities have been the worst, right? Like, their responses have been awful, right? And there are exceptions, et cetera. But I'm thinking specifically of Harvard and Stanford, like truly unacceptable in terms of their kind of, two-sidesism to what is obviously terrorism, right? And like really shocking, awful, like, I'm not my area of expertise, but there's a spectrum to terrorism. This is really bad terrorism, right? So their responses, and then you have kind of, I feel like the tech leaders and a lot of the people who, lead companies that are very global are kind of in the middle, right? And then it's just interesting to me that the politicians who are usually the worst, I think, have actually been the best, right? I guess this is their arena, and they are the ones that actually can pick sides. It's just interesting, again, that we live in such a globalized world with so many complicated constituents running around of who can say what, right? And who and who's willing to say what. It's just a fascinating set of problems to me, given the world we're in.
And so why won't, is it because business leaders are afraid of alienating users globally who have different points of view? Like, why? This is my question.
Well, since this is my first comment, I'll say that this is just evil. I have been besides myself about this all weekend. And the question, I guess, that I was going to ask in response to everything you guys are saying is this a question of education to some extent? Some people just don't know all of the history and complications of things over there. And you can throw down, like I can sit here and say, this is terrorism. This is just like absolute evil. Even in times of war, like all of this is anti the laws of war. Like we've been, as humanity throughout history for many thousands of years, has come to a set of rules around war. And all of that we're seeing is completely outside of it. And so you can condemn that and have that conversation, but also kind of be humble and say, I don't know the history. I don't know enough to comment on. No one's asking everyone
to solve the Israeli-Palestinian geopolitical crisis, right? And so I just think it's interesting. We have lots of examples of how business leaders have responded to terrorism, and 9/11 is a good one. And we are just very far from that with the statements coming from tech leaders, which could have easily said, 2 states, 1 state, whatever the political situation is aside, terrorism is terrorism, and we cannot support this. And we will protect our people, and we will do this. And so, it really leads me concerned that tech companies are they afraid of alienating users? There has to be business rationale behind these postures.
I would hope it's security.
I think they're captive. I think they're captive to cancel culture. I think that's partially what's going on.
What I was saying.
I hope not. And I'm an optimist, and I think I have a lot of respect for a lot of tech leaders. I think the probable reality is probably direct security concerns is my bet, right?
That's fair.
Like physical security of their employees and teams, which I understand. You are responsible for thousands of people globally, and unlike a government, you don't have guns, right? And so I think that is a generous interpretation I'm willing to take, right, for a lot of these highly global companies. But yeah, Dave, to your point, my view, again, I don't want to talk. I think we really need to try to not talk about the politics of it, but terrorism is terrorism, right? And the history is besides the point, right? It's very complicated.
You can acknowledge, I think very smart people there have been some really interesting statements, and they've really drawn the line of, people who've been critical of the Israeli government, but are still, condemning.
So I think the thing, so I think that's interesting. I do think that this kind of does bridge, though, a little bit, just to move on to the second topic of kind of how to think about news on social networks and, more broadly, right? We can talk about the tech leaders say as voices of this stuff. There's a lot of powerful voices. And one of the interesting things is, I'm not sure about you guys, but everything's on Twitter, right? Facebook, which was the
I refuse to call it X. I'm calling it Twitter forever.
Twex, whatever.
Just like I refuse to call Meta anything other than Facebook. I
did that once, and it made Meta people so mad. They were like, who are you to decide how our company is named? And I was like, And I was like, well, I'm just readers are currently confused because it's a day later, so be careful.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, just to everything is on Twitter. Threads is not banning news, but is also certainly not promoting it. Facebook, which was remember, if you guys go back to the early history of these types of things, was the Arab Spring, right?
Yeah.
Like that is where that happened, right? And that there was a moment before the Arab Spring went terribly wrong where Facebook was quite proud of that, right? That was a big moment of liberation before everyone realized that the outcomes weren't so great. But the upshot is that Facebook has basically said, we don't really want this stuff culturally on us. And I get why. Like, I think actually from a long-term perspective, it makes sense. But it is interesting that our digital commons right now has basically ended up in this place where the stuff that you kind of most want on these platforms, it's much easier to say, look, I just don't want to support it rather than trying to figure out what's true and false. Right. Yeah. I think that's kind of what's interesting is my bet is this is my column, by the way, preview column for those of you listening, is if you look forward to the next election cycle and what's going to happen with AI, it's pretty obvious that people are going to come to the conclusion that AI, effectively misinformation, is really, really dangerous, which it is, right? It makes Russian bot farms look like child's play. And that the solution is to drop Section 230 such that social networks are liable for it, right?
Explain Section 230, Sam. I don't think most people know what Section 230 is.
Well, Section 230 is basically the protections that say if you're an online platform, right, you're not liable for the speech that happens on your platform. And it's really important because, historically people said, look, we want to have digital commons. There's no way we can have these platforms be responsible for the content on them because they just couldn't possibly moderate it. And we want them to happen. So we'll give them kind of a waiver. It says you're not liable for the speech on your platforms. Really powerful, important concept. I think what's going to happen, right, is this will be the moment that the people will say, no more Section 230. Right. And then the interesting thing is that they're not going to get what they want out of that. What they probably want out of that is moderation for quality content. Instead, they're just going to get no content. Right. These services will say it's much easier to black it out, right, than it is to control it. And basically, then what's going to do is push it all underground. And then we're going to have a big fight over encryption, because by pushing all this content underground, you're not actually going to get rid of it. You're just going to scatter it to the wind in places it can't be found. And is actually in a lot of ways more insidious.
So like Telegram is what you're talking about.
Telegram, WhatsApp, encrypted chat. And all of a sudden people say, oh my goodness, we forced all the news out of the places we can see it, even the fake news. We forced it into places we can't observe in niche, crazy groups, right? So now we have to go after that, right? And I think you're going to end up finding this slippery slope towards it, trying to assault encryption for the sake of protecting people from AI points. So basically we have this thing coming. It was coming anyway. And I think what you're seeing now is all these platforms say, except for X, right, to say, we just don't even want to touch this stuff. Keep this off our platforms, et cetera, which is a real shame, right? Because, it does kind of say, where do you get your news from?
So I agree, Sam, Section 230 is dead. As Section 230, as it has existed, which is basically given, and really at the time it was the YouTube, allowed YouTube to flourish with user-generated content. And it says as long as you have a mechanism for taking down certain types of content, sort of the don't know, don't tell version of content moderation, right? I think that is, as we know it, dead in the water because of all of this. And we saw, the information reported this week that Elon had killed a tool that had been involved, that Exit or Twitter had been using to spot fakes and misinformation. And he killed it because it was hosted on Google Cloud. And in his big cost-cutting efforts, he had wanted to get rid of a lot of their cloud partnership services. And now I think it's the UK has now issued a letter to X basically saying your misinformation policies are in violation of the DMCA not the DMCA but their latest Digital Markets Act, right? And so I think that was hot off the press today. This is already happening. I guess I'm curious, maybe to Dave, what do you are we okay with this happening? Is this now, is it better that this is gone because of AI? If everyone was fighting so hard to keep it, what is lost if we really go in this direction of getting rid of this immunity for, all these platforms that are, does that question make any sense?
Yeah, I think you lose the public square, right? And like Sam said, you scatter all of this into the wind. People will be talking in encrypted channels all over the internet. It's something that, I mean, Sam, you and I have been talking about this for over a decade, that like, you know, the private internet and the public internet have always been very different places. The private internet used to be mostly behind company firewalls, right? Where you'd have tons of information that wasn't accessible to the public realm that's hidden behind company firewalls. And you could argue that that information is more valuable than the stuff that's in the public. And that's kind of always been the case. But as the last 10 years has played out, you've had the rise of the group chat. And, you know, even more so in the last 5 years, the rise of the encrypted group chat. And, you know, this is just going to push things even further in that direction. I mean, my experience of the last 3 or 4 days has been one of kind of a, you know, a shock, just incredibly just so sad about everything that's going on, horrified, but then this like almost panic about not being able to find which channel to pay attention to. You know, I'm over here looking at Twitter and I have no idea if anything that I'm seeing is real or, you know, is propaganda or what, because of the lack of supposed moderation over there. And then, you know, there's this conversation going on Threads and various other platforms of, you know, oh, well, you need to go and look at these encrypted chats in order to see this. And I'm not sure if those are the right ones. And you've just kind of got this low grade anxiety that arises where you're just like, what am I?
Have you thought of going to the New York Times? Like, and that's not a leading question.
I did go to the New York Times. No. I mean, I did. I always read the New York Times, you know, and I always read the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the big, you know, long running news organizations, right? And, you know, they've got also part of the story. And
trusting them is low. I mean, like, you know, the New York Times is so slow to call.
But your point is like they might not be covering as much, or I think it's an interesting question. Or do you not trust?
Well, they're definitely not. And I think this crisis, I mean, that we just experienced the last few days, is the first time where you're kind of like, where do I look for what's actually going on? And that's like a new thing. Like, I think it's just like good to call out that this is a new thing that we just experienced.
But also
right?
just to play the flip side here, like I've never been happier that my kids are too young to be on social media, and that I myself, who can stomach a lot, and I'm on, you know, most digital sites that we all know, don't sometimes just need to block it out. And I can't. I like want to open Instagram and see what some of my friends are up to, and I can't stomach seeing a video that I don't want to see. And so I'm not engaging with social media as much as I used to. And I think like, I know I should for some of the positive conversations or the community, you know, support that's needed. And so I'm having this like battle between actually not wanting it moderated out, or like in a separate tab or something, so that I can have a healthy mental health outlook.
I think that's a fair point, Mary. And the moments I feel that, I just don't go on, you know, because
it's important to point out that this was the intended outcome. And this is the thing I've been saying to Britt all weekend, is that like, this was very clearly a strategy. I mean, these guys are grabbing phones out of people's hands and then murdering them on their own phone. Like, this was like an intended strategy that was meant to cause this conversation amongst us, right?
Yeah, but to go back to the sort of, you know, look, if the big platforms, because they lose some of their or all of their or some of their immunity for what's on their services, right? They become more heavily moderated. I think you're right, Dave. I think you lose, you know, it's a loss for free speech. I mean, it just is, right? And those outlets begin to look a lot more like the New York Times or these other places, right? Where you can still have, I mean, very different, but
you further lose free debate. It's beyond freedom of speech. I mean, freedom of speech lives on, and it goes into encrypted channels, and people go even further into their echo chambers, right? And there's no common square, right? Like, that to me is actually the scariest thing, is that we will lose the common square entirely, right?
Few things. One, Britt, you know, to your point, I actually think you're making exactly the right argument, which is as a media, why a lot of large platforms are saying we don't want it, right? Because they're interested in you having a great experience, media experience. And they know lots of people are like you. They're just like, this is not, I don't want to worry that I'm going to open an app and have a terrible, awful day because I saw something I didn't want to see. So in that argument, it's good to not have this type of content on major media platforms, right? That's undeniably true. So I think that's like part of the story. And then Dave, to your point, it's like, yes, I mean, I think the scary part is these things will live on, they'll get more extreme, right? They'll be harder to track, et cetera. And it's all going to be on the encrypted side, right? And, when we end up in that space, it's going to be that the debate just becomes a really impossible thing to manage. The unintended consequences that I think politicians will think in their heads, oh, if we get rid of Section 230, it will force the companies to deal with fake information and fake news and AI news because we can't do it, right? What it will do, in fact, is say, not worth it. Much easier to just have none of it, right, than to try to moderate it, which is absolutely true, right? Like it is much easier to say this has something to do with news, don't even show it to anyone, versus trying to moderate it, right? And I think that's kind of where we're going to end up. And it's scary.
It is a gray area, though. Like you could say you can't post links from news organizations, but people talk about news, and a lot of what people talk about.
It's easy. You just say it's easy. You say the word Hamas just no longer shows up anywhere.
Yeah, or is like I think there are a lot of keywords that you can filter out and videos, graphics. AI could do a bunch of this.
You don't even need AI.
Yeah, it's called a blacklist of words. It's incredibly easy.
Well, an alternative idea is that like I still believe another social network regime should exist. Like there seems to be like more and more of a gap of like where to go for like actual relationships. Like I don't know that any one of these major social networks are going to just like not have news ever and like be a town square. And like like WhatsApp is a channel I go to for some group conversations, but like it feels like there's something in the middle that's still that people are yearning for that doesn't exist yet.
Like what, Britt?
I don't know, like Path 2.0 or something.
I feel like a lot of this podcast is Britt goading Dave into restarting Path, and I'm here for it. I just want to help.
Hey, I'm not the only one that wants it back, Jess. It's like a daily request.
I have editor friends who love it.
So you guys are saying I should get back in the studio and get back on that?
Yeah. Well, here would be the thing I'd say. I think this is because I was forced when I was writing this column for Jessica that maybe she'll run to come up with like, right. So I think getting rid of Section 2 is bad. And then going after encryption is even worse. And that's clearly where AI is going to take us. So I had to come up with some sort of positive end of like, well, then what? Right. I'll tell you what I came up with in the direction, which is, look, I think we just have to go back to where we were, which is you don't trust the networks, you trust individual people. Right. And what that ends up looking like is if you told me, this is kind of the crazy idea, that we need YPO for like celebrity influencers, where we get them all together, we give them tools, we build relationships, they do trust falls with each other. And we're like, we need you to support the commons. Right. It's like, The Rock and Kim Kardashian and Ronaldo, like you guys need to trust each other, even if you don't agree politically, and like we need you to come together and we need to build stronger relationships with celebrity influencers. And then maybe it's like kind of like a Lions Club or a Rotary Club thing. We need to bring back institutions that are peer-to-peer that people can trust and stop trying to rely on the public internet, stop trying to rely on like random characters, but like rebuild trust in society, which is hard.
Well, that's what the news used to be, right? Like you're saying that we
but
need
it's
to rely on people we trust, and that's what you used to think like all the journalists were, is like these are people you can trust, and they're bringing you the news, and it's fact checked, and it's like, I mean, Jess probably has a lot to say on this.
This could be a very important and empowering moment for high quality publications, right? Because there's going to be a thirst for that kind of trust. Publications can lose it faster than ever if they screw up, but they can also gain it and seize it and rise to the moment. But to do that, they have to do the hard job of great journalism without the distortion of their, 90% of their revenue coming from advertising or all these other things. So like the industry has a lot of challenges to work through, but like this could be an incredibly empowering moment for the news industry. But like there are no shortcuts and they can't fuck up. And that's, unfortunately not the pattern in a lot of news orgs.
I don't think it's going to be news orgs as much as I adore my wife. And I'll tell you why. I think it's a business model problem. So the news orgs have moved into a subscription model, which is correct for them, right? And if you look at kind of areas of low trust in history, like there's always been a retreat from public news to private newsletters going back, well into the Middle Ages when things get weird, when the elites really need to know what's going on, right? So they will thrive in a lot of ways, and that's going to be great. But they're not going to be the mass distribution, trusted things at scale, right? What they're going to be is kind of the thing for elites, right? Or for relative elites, whether that's 1% or 5% or 20%. And I think what you're going to find is that we need to get the celebrity influencers who do have the reach and they do have the trust to be not crazy, to be on the same page of each other and supporting civil society. So like The Rock is our final hope.
The Rock is our final hope. This could be our clip for the
This
podcast.
Is like The Rock. The Rock has to come through here and save civil society.
Okay, Sam, I think we should move to the third topic, which you actually started as the first in your amazing agenda, which is like, how does this change the trust between founders and LPs, but also just like reliability of companies? So I was talking to a founder earlier today who was in the midst of getting this big deal, like a pretty large M&A deal, with a company whose like CIO is Israeli and like hasn't picked up the phone for good reason, and probably is like enlisting in the army now. And so like, it's like, that's obviously just one example, but like this is shaking up the tech industry in other ways too, in terms of just like, not just the attention required, but the inattention for good reason, and how people are raising money. And so curious to hear all of your thoughts on what this does to impact the venture community.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the biggest thing that I was thinking about the other day, that relates to this is I worry about, I was thinking about what can tech founders do, right? We're so disconnected from what's going on the ground. Sure, you can donate money. Sure, you can write a tweet, but like, what impact do you really have? And I think the answer is honestly very little. It's a very disempowered moment, I think, when there's something you can do, right? I mean, I think in the early days of COVID or crises like that, there was this story of like, you can have an impact. And I just don't think there was much for you to do here sitting in the United States doing stuff. However, I do then think about the fact of like, where's the money coming from the fund that's funding this stuff, like directly, indirectly, et cetera? Not necessarily, and like I'm not saying that Hamas is investing in venture capital. They're not, right? But like you go 2-3 hops out, you start wondering, if I make someone a lot of money, what are they doing with it, and how do I feel about that, right? And I'll be the first to admit this is a very slippery slope, right? In terms of what you are okay with versus not okay with. Are you okay making money for someone who politically doesn't agree with you? Are you okay making money for someone who made their money in oil? Like there are places you can go that are, I think, not good. And one of the beauties of money is that it really is, a system that's very free and open, where all dollars are green, and that's actually very empowering in a lot of ways that we can get into. Like I'm very pro that system. But on the flip side, as an individual, like there are organizations I'd rather not make money for. And unfortunately, as the venture funding ecosystem from LPs has changed dramatically, it's no longer just hospitals and schools, right, that are LPs in venture funds. And so I just think one thing that, I think about, and I think founders should be thinking about, is it's totally fine to go to venture capitalists and say, hey, I'm going to take your money. I'm very excited to make you a lot of money, and I appreciate the support. But if I have competitive offers, et cetera, think about who do you want to make money for? VCs do this, right? VCs, at least good ones, say, hey, we're excited to make money for this hospital. We're excited to work for this university. Or maybe we're not excited to work for this university because we don't believe in their politics. I know of some instances where some well-known VCs have stopped some well-known schools from investing because they said, we don't want to work for you anymore based on your politics. So VCs do this. And I just think it's in every founder's right to do the same thing and say, look, when competing offers come in, who do I want to work for? And am I okay with, if I make this person $1 billion or a lot of money, what I think they're going to go do with that money? So it's a complicated issue. I think on the flip side to all of this, like globalism and globalization is good, right? And like, I don't think, for instance, the public markets being free and open to all comers that are legal is good, right? I think you can take this too far, but I think on a purely personal level, like there is more transparency you can bring to bear, and there is more choice you can bring to bear.
It makes me really happy to hear you say this, Sam. I thought, that we may be on opposite sides of this debate with each other. I think it's easy to take like the capitalism rules all debate, all money is green, but I just agree with you so wholeheartedly. And that this is an important moment to ask for that transparency that we otherwise, like you said, at the venture level, we're always talking about this question. One of my favorite questions to ask LPs is, what are you going to do with the money that we make you? Being able to, I think, demand this kind of transparency and enable people to make their own choices, I think, is a really awesome and valid point of view and call. And it's something that, I'm excited to advocate for. And I think you can advocate for transparency without actually being counter capitalism or counter globalism. I think it's a very simple statement to just say that like transparency here enables the individual founder or the individual venture investor to make their own decisions about who they're making money for. And that's like a totally valid thing to do.
I think while acknowledging, again, that 100 years ago, that would have been weaponized against Jews, right? That would have been, there would have been a bunch of people running around saying, oh, I don't want your dirty Jewish money, right? And so I do think it's like a complicated, it's not simple, right? To think about who you want to take money from and who you don't. But I do think when it comes down to, are they going to be using the money for good things or bad things? And how do I feel waking up every day and knowing I'm working for these people? The free market is the free market. And I'm totally fine with a world where the government sets the rules of the road and you accept that it's completely open system. I think it's actually good for society for that to be the case. It's very different when you have a tightly held small company, right, with a few investors. I think you get the right to pick. And I'm willing to take some of the consequences of the system not being a perfectly free and open capitalist system where all money is green.
It's a really, really important topic. And I'm interested to see what you guys and other GPs kind of do on this front. I mean, I think it's not, there have been other types of pushes for transparency around things like gender diversity and others, not so much as far into the LP stack, more around the portfolios, but those have gotten real traction and laws have passed in California and other places around.
Yeah, I mean, we just had a law passed this weekend, right? Gavin sign a law into
starting March 2025, we are all going to be reporting our diversity status of all of our portfolio founders, which I think is going to get really murky. It's a whole different topic.
I think it's ridiculous. I mean, I have to say that I'm happy to hold at some other point the debate about why that is ridiculous. But a founder asking for transparency to LPs and venture firms figuring out how to provide it is not, because it is a subtle difference, but it is an important one in my mind.
Sam, I think you're going to have to defend why you think it's ridiculous in your own words.
I understand. I think I understand why you think it's ridiculous, but I do think we should state, at least I will state, that the intent is positive, even if the process itself is going to be very murky and ridiculous.
Okay.
All right.
We'll end it there. We'll bring that back up in another episode.
Yeah, we can bring that back up. You know what? We're going to create some controversy in some online comments, of people telling me I'm a terrible person, which will drive some clicks and views. So we'll leave it at that. And then next week,
I think you should just spread some misinformation, especially on X, Sam.
Next week, tune in for my justification of how I can believe both of those things at the same time.
Okay. And with that, I want to correct that I had said it was the UK that had issued these warnings to X and I guess Meta about misinformation in the war, and it was the EU. So I just want everyone to hold that
for
fact. And thank you guys for an important conversation. I think it reflects a lot of the conversations we've been having and tries to, while looking at one small aspect of what's playing out, get a view of what might be to come. And just want to end by again sharing our, as I said, as many people have said, our real thoughts and support for everyone struggling through this, and to also clearly condemn what is happening in the terrorism. And, I urge people in far more powerful positions to do the same, because that is really what's called for this moment. So To all our listeners and viewers, thank you guys for your continued support on everything we do. And we'll be back next week. Send us your thoughts as always, and have a good week.
See you guys.
See you guys.
If you enjoyed this show, please leave us a virtual high five by rating it and reviewing it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Find more information about each episode in the show notes, and follow us on social media by searching for @MoreOrLess, @DaveMorin, @Lesson, @JLesson, and as for me, I'm @Brit. See you guys next time.